even started yet. So I just want to start off by saying thanks to all of you. You know, my stepfather, I grew up on the Gulf Coast down in southern Alabama. He volunteered a lot after retirement, and I swear worked more as a volunteer than he did when he was working before he retired. And I just assume it's because the pay is so good. But appreciate what you guys do, not just the docents out front, but the folks downstairs. You know, I spent my entire career in aviation maintenance, so I definitely know what it's like working in the garage to make sure that all the things that people see on the front end, you know, look and perform the way they're supposed to. So I appreciate that. I am Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Champagne, so I'm a Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Space Force. I do acquisitions for the Space Force, acquisition and engineering, but I've only been doing that for about a year. So Space Force is almost 5 years old. December of 2019 is when they started. I moved over in August of last year. And prior to that, I did 23 years in the Marine Corps. So I'm going to burn through some slides. Normally this goes a little bit longer. I'll go a little fast because I know there's probably some of you out there that just want to make fun of the Space Force for 10 minutes at the end of this, which is absolutely fine. So we have an active duty footprint of Space Force Guardians here in San Diego. And so we came about 6 months ago to talk to the museum and really just say like, hey, San Diego is a huge military town. We have Space Force here now. There's only 4 of us, but we're trying to get more. And we see a GPS satellite down there. You have a satellite program that's based out of San Diego. You should have one of our satellites, right? And so we're like, how do we get an exhibit? So that's kind of how this started was, could we do maybe some information about what Space Force is? So as a docent, we're talking to people through sort of the military section. There's some, and oh, by the ways. And then maybe down the road, there's an opportunity to have some kind of exhibit here and maybe some other places in the community. So I will show a quick video first that just kind of is the Space Force's origin of Space Force. I think does a pretty good job of sort of the inspirational start. And then I'll go through some details on Space Force itself, things that people generally ask, and then a little bit specifically about our program. If you got any questions along the way, or you're like, hey, what does that mean? Like, feel free to stop me. I don't mind at all. I've been doing this a long time and have had people with stars on their collar throw stuff at me to get me to stop talking. So it's not gonna hurt my feelings. Any questions before we start? No?
Yes, I have one.
Yeah.
Are you guys positioned in the recruiting office?
So that's a good question. Not really yet. We recruit via the Air Force recruiters. And so if an interested applicant comes in and says, hey, what's the Space Force thing about? They'll work with an Air Force recruiter who will hand them off to a Space Force recruiter, but it's typically virtually, and it's out of the Pentagon. And then the Space Force right now does 2 selection boards a year. So you apply, if your tests are good enough, and then we board and say we want you, then we have 2 classes a year that go through boot camp in the same place, but they go through with other Space Force Guardians. And it's about 70% the same and about 30% kind of specific to Space Force as they go through training.
So boot camps in Lackland?
Yep, yeah, still in Lackland. Yes, sir.
Just to get a picture of what the Space Force is as it grows, how many people do you have on it right now?
So right now, I'll have a chart that shows just how kind of crazy this is. So right now we have, by the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2024, pretty sure our end strength was 9,400. So less than 1% of the Department of Defense. That's all active duty officers and enlisted. And we have about the same number of government civilians. Depending on who you talk to in the Space Force, you know, with stars on their collar, you know, they're kind of saying somewhere between 18 and 23,000 is where they think eventually we may end up. They don't really want to get any bigger than that, just because they want to keep the roles focused on those few core kind of competencies that we have. Now, if something crazy kicks off on the moon and they need a presence on the moon, maybe that changes. That's why I joined. I thought they were going to need like space door gunners. I don't. So I did 10 years enlisted. Sorry, I was going to talk about this before. I did 10 years enlisted in the Marine Corps working on aviation stuff, ComSec, GPS receivers, radar, you name it. I've worked on the intermediate level, so the kind of back shop repair on every Navy and Marine Corps aircraft that's been flying since 2000. Because of some of the stuff we did out on the ships and then in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then I transitioned to be a warrant officer, so I went to Chief Warrant Officer 3 and I did flightline support for F-18s, V-22s, CH-53 Echoes. And then I transitioned again to be a limited duty officer. In the Marine Corps you have to go warrant officer to LDO. It's not like the Navy where you pick one or the other. And then I worked for Naval Air Systems Command for Vice Admiral Peters at the time, who was the Naval Air Commander, on standing up essentially an electrical power quality program. We didn't have one for naval aviation. We were having a lot of mishaps due to faulty electrical systems, bad wiring on some of these old aircraft. And so I was tasked with standing up that program. Came back here to work for the Commanding General of 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, and then that's when I was picked up to shipped over to Space Force. So kind of a diverse career in terms of aviation, and then Marine Air Ground Task Force stuff for infantry support. So.
GPS, ATMs, cell phones, gas pumps, traffic lights, power grids, guided missiles, surveillance, RPAs, ground combat control. There's no such thing as a day without space operations. You just don't see them. Earth is only half the battle. Cyber attacks and jamming of our satellites. Microsatellites that can create a debris field. At 17,000 miles an hour, a piece of metal the size of a coin can be weaponized. Now is the time for a military branch with a clear and singular focus on space. A military branch that protects the hopes and dreams of America and our way of life as the space domain becomes more and more contested. It's time for another giant leap. The United States Space Force is being built from the brightest minds across the space operations of the Air Force, our joint services, and the private sector. We aren't just getting ready for the near future, we're getting ready for the 22nd century. When our enemies ask, what if? We will have an answer. When foreign powers can build bases on the dark side of the moon, when private companies are inventing a new economy beyond our planet, we need to stay one step ahead of the future. The future is where we'll make history. We will fight in an environment with no up or down, no left or right, where there are no borders and nowhere to hide. Our Space Force is defending our country, here on Earth and wherever our mission takes us. As commerce and exploration expand, we will imagine the unimaginable, anticipate the inconceivable, and prepare for the impossible. We won't just think outside the box, we'll think outside the atmosphere. One of the most challenging environments ever known.
So based on that video, I think like 1,000 of the 9,400 people we have are in marketing. Who watches this video? Will any kids see this? I'm not like vulgar, but I might slip and say something. So forgive me if I do. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Is Space Force heavy on higher ranks, or do you really have E1s and?
Yeah, so we do. My community and the acquisition community is heavy. It's all officer in acquisition engineering because they come straight out of college as engineering backgrounds into doing acquisition. It's kind of one of the things we were talking about before. I don't think that's a great way to do it. You know, in every other service, you have to do 10 years out doing something, and then you can transfer over and do acquisition. So you kind of know the user experience, right? So now we have a bunch of engineers building stuff that have never built anything, right? So you're going to have the oil filter that you got to take off, you know, the whole left side of the car to get the oil filter off, do an oil change, like that kind of mentality. So it's about 50-50 enlisted and officer right now, and I suspect that as cyber and intel the cyber and intelligence communities grow, which is where I think we'll see the most of our growth to get to that sort of 20,000 number, our enlisted numbers will rise. Is kind of what I think will happen.
You keep saying acquisitions. What does that mean?
I'll tell you. I'll get to that.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, the one question I got, and I've been looking at this since the Space Force was founded, there's treaties that state that there'll never be weapons on orbit.
Yep.
So what relationship do you have with National Command Authority? Is it just soft kills, or
Yeah, so so the relationship is just like with the other services where, and I'll talk kind of about organizational structure, but the Space Force presents forces to the combatant commanders. So Space Force presents forces to the NORTHCOM combatant commander for all of the things that are, stationed here, or the EUCOM commander, whoever else. So if at some point there was a weapon in space that you could use from space that was an actual kinetic space-based weapon, that command authority would go through the combatant commanders to execute that. It would be a Space Force person, probably pushing the button from an op center somewhere, but the command authority resides with the combatant commander.
Well, the thing I was getting at is, will, for instance, the flag officer in the Space Force have weapons release authority for a national command?
Likely not. Yeah. Again, especially Air Force. Half the pilots in the Air Force still don't have release authority. They gotta go. Anyway, yeah. So I'll go through some of the slides kind of quick because it's just sort of boilerplate. But this is sort of all the things, right, that space enables. And really, the most important thing to our way of life is global positioning. And really, when the kids think global positioning, they think they're like cell phones. But really, the most important part of that position, navigation, and timing is the timing. So everything that happens on the internet is based on timing. So about, I think it was 2017, 2018 timeframe, there was like a few microsecond glitch that was based on a GPS anomaly, and it threw the stock market into chaos across the globe, the global stock market. And I think it was somewhere like 72 hours for the global markets to catch back up. And that was off of an accidental, minuscule timing difference that impacted trading. So you can imagine if you have an adversary who's able to not just block you from using those things, but tell you that it's a different time and actually spoof those timing signals, it can be kind of a big deal. Why is space becoming important? After the Gulf War was really what we consider the first space war. So we were really pushing net-enabled weapons at that point in time. Our operators, our tanks specifically, had what at the time was sovereign DoD GPS. So they were able to make it across the desert through these massive sandstorms when some of the other adversaries couldn't. And so there were a lot of things that we kind of said, oh man, this is amazing, and what are we going to do if we don't have this? And so it really wasn't a big deal during the global war on terror, the global economy with what it was. We didn't have to concern ourselves too much with having a competitor in that domain. And so you can kind of see since 2007 how that's really changed in terms of what some of our adversaries are doing, specifically China and Russia, who have not only developed but have demonstrated via kinetic attacks the ability to shoot something out of orbit from the ground, which first of all is an interesting capability, but the second and third order effects of that, just from not from a warfighting perspective, but just from a life on the planet perspective, you blow something up over the ocean, it all falls into the water. You blow something up in space, it spreads apart indefinitely, right? And so now you have this massive debris cloud spinning around the globe at 17,000 to 20,000 miles an hour. So it becomes kind of a big deal. So, one of the reasons that I personally think we should have a Space Force, and I've kind of thought this for a long time, is we had all of our former military branches, services, were going out and doing their own thing. So the program I'm in was a Navy UHF narrowband satellite communication program. The Army had a very similar narrowband satellite communication program. The Air Force, very similar. So you had these sort of multi-hundred-million-dollar programs that were being fielded by different services for the same capability. In some instances stepping on each other, in other instances really just buying the same requirement again. And then you also had services, let's take the Air Force for instance, they had the largest space budget. Do you ever think a 3-star general who flew B-1s, when he goes to do a budget review, is going to sacrifice a squadron of B-1s to put budget into a new space program that we need? Maybe, but probably not, right? And so it became very apparent that we need, for both budgetary and kind of planning perspective, and then also for the actual warfighting functions, we needed to centralize the space domain and make sure that we had a service that was focused just on thinking about space. And I put this up here to kind of show, post-Gulf World War, and then specifically in 2001, there was kind of referred to as the Rumsfeld Commission. But essentially, it was a commission to go look at how we are managed for space architecture and make some recommendations. And one of those recommendations was it probably needs to have a military department for space. So this is in 2001. It took us 18 years to really get there through advocacy and a few other things. And then ultimately, President Trump in 2019 signs Space Force into being. This was our previous commander of the Space Force. And then this is kind of our current, this is our current commander of the Space Force. And one of the things that he's kind of been pointing out routinely is the war in Ukraine has shown not just that we've got to be worried about the Chinas and the Russias and the Indias that have, are really putting a lot of their gross domestic product into space innovation and technology. Ukraine doesn't have any sovereign space capabilities, but they're able to buy ISRs or surveillance and reconnaissance photos to almost any nth of detail they want from the commercial market. They're able to leverage Starlink for a lot of their operations. And so it really kind of shows that even if you're dumping tons of money into this and you have an adversary that isn't, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're blocked off from the space domain. One thing that the Space Force is starting to focus on is leveraging commercial, specifically in our program, something that we're starting to go look at. But there's a balance there, because if you've been watching the Ukraine conflict, one of the things that happened was Ukraine had an unmanned surface vessel that they were going to use to blow up a Russian boat, and I don't want to say it was Elon Musk, but Starlink turned off their feed. So they're in the middle of a knot to go blow up a Russian boat, and there were thoughts that that was going to escalate things beyond where they were at the current, that current point in time. So they turned off their service. We are going to use commercial capabilities, so if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we have the right hooks in place so that things like that don't happen. So these are sort of the level of efforts that our new CSO has put out to us, which is field combat ready forces, amplify the guardian spirit. So like, what is Space Force? What should we care about? What are our ethos? The Air Force has like 100 patches that they can wear like all the way up your shoulder, and I think like they can go 3/4 of the way down the back of your, it's not that many, but they got all kinds of patches. They're supposed to say like, what do you do in the Space Force? How important are you? I came from the Marine Corps. Like, we have one patch. Maybe if you're a recon, you wear something different, right? But you don't wear, like, nobody wears a patch that says, I do acquisitions. Who cares? Of all the things, right? So it's really about who are we and like what are the things that we need to be focused on, and then partnering to win. The other big thing about space is everybody's going to be there. We have our system's global coverage. So what does that mean for host nation approvals and inter-service and then inter-coalition interoperability? So if we're going to go do something in Eurocom, we want everybody to be able to talk. We don't want to have 2 telephones so that we can talk to our coalition partners and our U.S. partners separately. So partnering to win. So Space Force, right? This tiny little sliver right there is Space Force compared to essentially everyone else. So yeah, FY23 we're 8,600, FY24 9,400. The one kind of cool thing about Space Force is because there are so many government civilians that support the force, they really push everyone is a guardian, right? They don't go to basic training, things like that. But it's one of the things that the CSO has continually kind of pitched is that, for all of our civilian counterparts, hey, you're just as important as everybody else that's here. And a lot of services say that. Like, I never had a government civilian in the Marine Corps that would have been like, I'm a Marine. Like, it never would have happened, right? So it's something that I think is interesting and kind of taking a different approach. So this is how Space Force is structured. So we have 3 major commands. We have Space Operations Command, which is out of Peterson Air Force Space Force Base in Colorado Springs. So those are the guys that fly the satellites, right? They sit in an ops center. They're monitoring what's happening with the satellites. Are they healthy? Are they doing the things that they need to do? And then if there are capabilities that are, we'll say, steerable, they're the ones executing those changes, right? A combatant commander, his staff calls in and says, hey, we need X for this exercise coming up, and they deconflict all of those things. They're also the ones that do kind of the early warning for space domain awareness for missile launches, ballistic missile launches across the globe, things like that. Space Systems Command, headquartered in Los Angeles, that's who I work for, and that is all of the equip portion of man, train, and equip. So any of the systems that were previously space related from all of the other services have now been folded into the Space Force, and we manage and or do new procurements through Space Systems Command in Los Angeles. And then Space Training Command is also in Colorado Springs. They do all of the training and then test and evaluation for new stuff. I throw this one up here just because we've done a couple of briefs and people kind of talk about when you're talking different orbits and things, what does that really mean? And so this is just to kind of show really the three major orbits that we use, which is geosynchronous, medium Earth orbit, and low Earth orbit. There's some other like highly elliptical and other things, but it just kind of shows these are generally the kinds of satellite systems that we're going to put in those different areas. So you'll hear when I get to our program, we're geosynchronous, so we're way out there at 22,250 or so miles, depending on a few different factors. And the forest is trying to push to more proliferated low Earth orbit, kind of like Starlink, those kinds of things, or mid-Earth orbit, because of sort of the cost to get the geo and the targets that it presents. I'll talk about that a little bit when I get to our stuff. This is just kind of a visualization of different stuff that's out there.
You do intelligence gathering?
Yes, so a massive part of the Space Force is intel. So kind of at the higher level, so we have some products that we collect and then we do the analysis on, and then we give those reports to whoever needs them. And then a lot of it we're pushing down. So we support the integrated broadcast service on ours, which is the intelligence community feed. So a lot of different stuff comes in and then we broadcast it all out across the globe. And this is just sort of a map of where we currently have Guardian stationed. And the overseas portions are starting to grow. So we've got a couple new billets in Japan, a couple of additional billets in South Korea. I think they're putting some in Australia. So we're starting to pop up a few other places. And those are mostly on joint staff at the 05 and 06 level to be advisors to the COCOMs for whatever's going on. Yes, sir?
Has any of the other services given up anything to you?
Yes, a lot of stuff. Some budget people, so all 90s, well, I shouldn't say all. Of the 8,600 we had in FY23, probably 98% of those were from the other services.
No, but I meant authority.
Yeah, so on the operation side and on the Title 10 acquisition side, so being able to spend money, so Title 10 and Title 50 sides, we've pulled over, so for instance, ours was a Navy program, so we pulled that Navy program over, so the operations management of that program to facilitate whatever's going on across the globe has now shifted to Space Force, along with the budget, and then along with any of the sustainment and additional procurement activities. So that's happened across every service. Really, the Coast Guard was the only one that I don't think had any that were their own systems. Army had quite a bit, particularly in sort of the RF comms realm. Air Force had a ton. We're still a Department of the Air Force, but had a ton that shifted over to the Space Force CSO as sort of the managing authority for those assets. And then the Navy had quite a bit. Navy, I mean, HF communications started essentially in San Diego with the Navy, bouncing HF communications off the ionosphere for beyond line of sight. And so this was, I mean, really, San Diego and sort of the Navy yards on the East Coast were the birthplace of over the horizon comms, which has been cool to now, having been on the user side of that, get to be kind of behind the curtain. So career fields, acquisition and engineering, all officers. Whether that changes in the future, we'll see. I think we're getting, I mentioned before, guy goes to college, gets an engineering degree, wants to join the Space Force, can join as an acquisition guy, and right off the bat, he's going to go start trying to buy things for the Space Force, right? But he's never really seen like how this stuff gets used, what people need. So we've changed that. Any new accessions to Space Force in the acquisition or engineering community will go to an operations command first. Now, I still kind of have a bone to pick with Space Force because they consider operations like being in Peterson and Colorado Springs in an ops center with like air conditioning and fluorescent lights and a snack machine outside. So we're trying to get some billets. We do a lot of warfighter integration here in San Diego because it's San Diego and we have Special Warfare Training Center, 3rd Fleet, Commander Naval Air Forces, Camp Pendleton, and the MEF right up the street. So we're trying to get a couple billets to actually, I want to send them on deployments and exercises. You spend a year and a half working for the MUS program and you're gone all of it, like 99% travel. You're going from exercise to operation to deployment so that you can get a feel for what the warfighter cares about, because it is not what most of our community thinks they care about, in my opinion. Cyberspace is a really big one, which is also kind of like computer programming, intelligence, and then space operators. And normally the intel and space operators and cyber kind of fit together. You'll normally have a big contingent of cyber and intel in the ops centers. And then we're supported all of our medical, admin, like all of the extra stuff the Air Force does for us, which Space Force has a lot of aspirational things they want to do in terms of like managing people and workforce development, but it's really hard to do that when all of your HR structure is a different service and is built for different things. So there will probably be a time in the future where Space Force kind of carves off and does some of their own stuff, and then we'll just have to retrain Air Force airmen when they come to service a Space Force base. And then another big part, like I talked about, is partnering with allies. So these are kind of all the places we have exchange tours with. I was in Canada last week. So Canada is getting some access to MUOS, sort of sovereign access, their ability to stand up some of their own networks and do their own things with the system, but also be able to join any network that we allow them to join. And it was the biggest foreign military sales case in Space Force's illustrious 4 3/4 year history. But we went up there, they did their initial operational capability kind of sign off last week. So it was pretty neat to see them use the system and see how well their artillery folks specifically really like it and some of the things to be able to change for them. And I'll get to what our system does here in a minute. And then for our civilian folks, all the same kind of roles for military, we also have on the civilian side. Another interesting thing Space Force just started this year is for cyber, and actually just cyber this year, you can essentially say, hey, this is all the experience I have, right? I've been doing cyber operations for the commercial sector for 10 years. I have all these certifications, but I'm interested in serving my country, but I gotta make a bunch of money now, and I can't be an E1. So they have some different processes now where they can come in at a higher rank. The Navy has done this for doctors and lawyers in the past, so Space Force is starting to do that for cybersecurity because cyber is huge, and I wouldn't say we're behind. I think our technology is better in most instances, but in terms of just the sheer volume of people, Iran, for instance, has a cybersecurity arm of their military that's like 4 times the size of all of Space Force, and all they do is cyber, right? So playing a little bit of catch up just in terms of bodies. Right, this says University of San Diego on it. Don't worry about that. I have to go there. I'm going there this afternoon to talk to their innovation and commercialization branch. But just a couple slides. I'll take like 5, maybe 7 minutes to get through these about what our program specifically does. That again was a Navy program up until 2 years ago. So our program is the Mobile User Objective System. And so anybody prior service that retired like in the last 15 or 20 years. 20, that's right. So about 20 years ago, mid to late 90s, we got SATCOM via it was the UHF follow-on program. So it was UFO, and you could get 5 kilohertz DAMA, we called it, which was like you share, you sign up to be on a call list, and maybe if you're high enough priority when you call, you'll get a spot. I never, in like 15 years of trying to use it, did I ever get an actual spot. And then we had 25 kilohertz channels that were dedicated where I had this specific operation or whatever I needed for a certain amount of time. So MUOS took over for UFO. We still have some UFO satellites on orbit that our program manages. In fact, we still have some FleetSat satellites on orbit that were like late 70s, early 80s that we sort of still manage. We try to make sure they don't crash anything. So again, we're a narrowband satellite communication, and we're predominantly targeted at dismounted tactical users. So the guy with the radio in the back of the Humvee, the squad that's out on patrol, submarines which aren't dismounted but are disadvantaged in a lot of instances. It's a good waveform. It's a good frequency band for urban terrain, so lots of buildings and like clutter around. Dense foliage, it works really well through, and weather, which is again why it's a very good resource for the tactical users. And then because of the way our system's set up, they can also have a fairly small radio. They need a lot of power to close link the satellite. And this is just kind of a representation of some of the folks we support, including cruise missiles. So we have some on some of the cruise missile PACE plans. They've got US receivers in there. So we are a late 90s 3G cellular system, but instead of cell phone towers, we have satellites that are 22,000 miles up in space. But our ground system was when the government was really pushing like buy commercial off the shelf. And so the Navy was like, okay, we're gonna go try and buy commercial off the shelf. And we tried to leave it as commercial as possible, but it was like commercial, Ericsson, proprietary, giant pain in the butt now to try and keep running. So we've got a lot of modernization efforts that are happening right now while also trying to see, okay, we had 3G 20 years ago, there's probably something better that we could use. Let's see what the next thing is. And something that a lot of people that haven't spent a lot of time around the service. Yes, sir?
Which brings up an issue. Are there any plans to refuel, refurbish, repair satellites in orbit on your part?
Not for our program. Yes, for some other programs. I don't think we have anything that is incredibly mature. We have some on-orbit refueling capabilities that are getting to be more mature. But I think if you talk to sort of the science and technology folks about, hey, where do we want to get? That's definitely out there. In fact, this is not Space Force opinion, this is my nerdy like sci-fi opinion, is, you know, if I were a commercial company that had enough money to get involved, there's a few, you know, the Lagrange point between here and the moon, which Lagrange point is the point at which gravity is almost zero. So you're at the right point between the Earth and the moon where the Earth's not really pulling you towards the Earth, the moon's not really pulling you towards the moon. It doesn't take you a lot of propulsion to stay in that spot. You know, there's us, China, India, Russia are all trying to kind of get footholds in those areas because there's at some point in the future, we're going to have large commercial centers at some of those points where, you know, you're bringing stuff and you're building things, you know, there, not really in orbit, but out in some of these places. Yes, sir.
This may be too far in the grass to talk about, but Tomahawk B, they can do retargeting flight. Now, when they're looking for a satellite, do they have to wait in line to get a satellite, or do they have a channel locked in for them?
So, I will not talk specific to a weapon system,
Okay.
but there are, depending on the, so there are multiple prioritization lists out there, right? And there's systems that will automatically sort of triage those lists. Depending on the weapon system and the mission, in many instances, it will be dedicated throughout the whole time. What tends to happen is there's never just one pathway, right? So there's a base plan. You have a primary and alternate. And I don't remember what the C and E stand for off the top of my head. But you essentially always have at least 4 kind of pathways for anything that we do. And so there would be normally probably your primary and secondary, again, depending on the mission, are probably dedicated. And then you have some backups where if you showed up in the queue, you would automatically bump to the top.
Gotcha.
And then the other thing I was going to say about some of the sort of on-orbit repair and things like that is, you know, like in 11, SpaceX Starship is going to completely change the game. Like, the ability to launch payloads that are that big is going to fundamentally change everything that we've ever done in space. And so I think you're going to see, if that becomes successful over the next 5 to 10 years, and they're launching Starships like they're launching, you know, Falcon 9 payloads now, space has the potential to look completely different than it does now. And hopefully we're ready for it. These are just some of the things we can do at the terminals. It's kind of like geeky talk, but really top secret, confidential, unclassified. We can kind of do any level of classification they need. And then we have the ability to do like your old Nextel push to talk, right? You can build a group of people, and anytime one person talks, everybody hears it. Anytime one person transmits data, everybody gets it. Or you can have a point-to-net kind of situation where I have this giant network, and when I talk, only these like 6 people need to see it, right? And so your comm planners build all that stuff out. They know how the system works. And they're able to do that on some enterprise systems that the Space Force now manages. And so this is why our system was really cool to me. So for UFO back in the day, for narrowband communication, it was great. I could do over the horizon. But all of us had to be talking to the same satellite. So I was over here, you know, I'm maybe in the Philippines and this guy's in Japan. So we're in the same satellite footprint. We can talk to each other. But at the point at which that satellite goes over the horizon and my radio can no longer connect with it, I can't talk to that guy anymore. We both have to be in the same satellite footprint. And when this one gets over me and I want to talk to it, I gotta wait until the next guy gets it. That's assuming you're not geosynchronous like we are and they don't move. So what MUOS does differently is kind of what cell phones do, which is It's just a bent pipe. So the warfighter talks up to the satellite pushes that information down into a ground system, and then we have 5 ground systems that are spread across the globe, 4 ground systems that are spread across the globe that route all of that traffic via the DISA, so our government fiber networks. And it knows this guy is in this group or is in this net, and it pushes that traffic to where it needs to be so it can get sent up to that satellite and down to the right person. So now I can be in the Philippines and I can talk to somebody in Point Mugu, California, or in the Pentagon. One of the big things that the Canadians love are like, hey, you could have a Viper, like top secret, Viper phone, and you could call through the system to the pilot in the F-18. And the general's like, oh, that's amazing. And the F-18 pilot's like, are you kidding me? No, don't do that. Turn it off. Crank caller. Like, I don't want to answer that. Right? But pretty incredible capability. And again, that's voice, data. That's, years ago, everybody wanted to talk. I can tell you right now, the pilots that are joining today, guess what they don't want to do? Talk. What do they want to do? They want to text, right? You got a 9-line, send it to me via chat. And then there's no mistakes. It's right in front of me. I need to push coordinates over, X checks, any of that stuff, it all happens via chat. And a lot of them are automated these days too, so it's pretty cool. Our system enables a lot of those things. That's a lot of what we use it for when I was in the Marine Corps. Massive, so we talk like kind of why we're looking at different orbits and different things. So this thing is 22,000 miles up in space. This is a human right there. That thing wrapped in foil is this, so these 16 massive diplexers that put 16 different beams down on the planet. Along with its solar panels and its other, its reflector array for UFO, it's a massive, massive target in space. And it doesn't move, so it's there all the time. So everybody always knows where it is. So if you want to disrupt the system and you have anti-satellite, ground-based munitions, pretty easy to do that. Our system is fairly resilient, so even if we lost one, we can still work for a while. But the fact of the matter is they're very big, very expensive strategic targets for the enemy. And then another kind of cool tidbit is at the time that MUOS was standing up, we had the largest terrestrial communications satellite antennas ever put into service. We have 3 at each ground station, so Oahu, Northern Virginia, Nishimi, which is on Sicily, about an hour from Sigonella, and then Geraldton, Australia, which is on the west part of Australia in the middle of nowhere. Oh, there you go. Here's where we have stuff. All right, so I left like 9 minutes. I got through that pretty quick. Left like 9 minutes for just comments, discussions. Like I said, my sort of impetus to coming was to give some info, and then hopefully as you guys are walking around, you'll be like, oh yeah, and they do this kind of stuff. So, yes sir?
A lot of the work I did in the Navy was with JTIDs, Link 16, what have you. We also got involved with satellite with the Army.
Yep.
Which formats are you sticking with, or are you trying to cover them all?
So, for us, the format doesn't matter. So for instance, we can push, we can do some cross-linking and push JREAP-C type data. When I was in the Marine Corps, my last project in the Marine Corps was putting in, we call it the Marine Air Ground Task Force Agile Network Gateway Link, MANGLE, on a V-22, which was essentially a mesh network processor. We would slap a PRIC 117 Golf, we would slap a small tactical terminal, we would smack a Quint 200, and it would give us ANW2, which is primarily infantry-based comms. It would give us MUOS. It would give us Link 16. It would give us tactical TTNT, Tactical Targeting Network. Something, I don't remember what T, technology I think is what T stands for. And common data link for video feeds. So it would give us all 5 of those, agnostic to the pilot. He didn't need to know, like, this guy's on this channel. It just showed up to him, the traffic, right? And so what we did is, for instance, when we were in the Indo-Pacific region somewhere, we would primarily use those line of sight Link 16 type waveforms for all of our internal stuff around the location. And then we would push all of that traffic, or any of the traffic they cared about, over MUOS to the command center so that they could update their common operational picture. And so when the commanding general of one MEF has got this massive operation going on and he needs to know when certain execution checks have happened, they get those execution checks in almost real time.
The reason I asked is you mentioned we were doing text transmissions.
Yep.
Like the 9 lines, what have you. And recently, even in the news, they've been talking a lot about the J28 format.
Yep.
Are you sticking to that, or is it kind of?
So ours is so you go into the term. So if you're talking, the terminals do analog voice. They digitize it and they make it IP protocol internet traffic, and it pushes it over as IP data. So you embed your J-series message, whatever format you need it to come out at the other end of. It packages it in IP, pushes it out, and then it unpackages on the other end and pushes it out however it needs to be. And so what typically would happen is, we call it black transport. We're not looking at the data as it goes through the system. So on the other end, they would be doing whatever decrypting they needed to do, and then their message traffic would go where it needs to.
Sounds like bacon.
Sort of. They have space bacon now too. Yes, sir.
I have a couple questions. The Space Force handles the GPS satellites?
They do, yes.
How many of them do we have up there, and how many of them are working at any given time? And what other countries have their own GPS satellites?
Those are excellent questions. I think 7 need to be working at any given time. You need to have a link to at least 3 for most like generic GPS receivers. The constellation is big. I wouldn't even be able to guess at a number. And I think how many are in operation, the specific number is probably at some classification level, but plenty. There are 5 sort of well-known other point navigation and timing systems that have been launched by other countries. Clonaz and a couple of others. We primarily use 3 of those 5, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. Funny enough, the Space Force, so we don't take physical fitness tests annually anymore. You sign up for this study and they send you a Garmin watch, and it tracks how much you do throughout the course of a week, and as long as you hit these minimums, and then as long as your VO2 max, like your actual respiratory sort of ability to do work, as long as they stay in the healthy region, they leave you alone. But when we first got the watches, one of the primary GPS signals that they had programmed in was Russia's GPS constellation, which they changed right after, but was a little like, we're getting a brief. We're like, really, guys? So yeah, sorry I don't have a better answer for that. So GPS is managed out of Space Systems Command, both for the standard MilSatcom GPS and then also for some of the other constellations that are a little more protected. Yes, sir?
So, not numbers, but of all the percent, in terms of percent, of all the military satellites that are in orbit, what percent are managed by the Space Force?
It's probably, I want to say it's really, really high, but so Space Domain Awareness is kind of an NRO, so National Reconnaissance Office has a very big space footprint, and they do things a little differently. And most of their stuff is, special access program type stuff. So of the normal white world DoD satellites, almost 100%. About as close to 100% as you can get. But there are some, U.S. space assets that are not in Space Force managed because they're NRO assets, or a couple other. NOAA has a couple that they still have up that they manage. We also manage quite a few of NOAA's systems. So I think eventually the intent is for Space Force to sort of have all of those under the umbrella, with the exception of probably NRO. I don't imagine they're going to get theirs up, because they're also, that's a lot of the intelligence community uses their stuff directly, and they have some different Type 50.
So this has been a gradual
Correct.
assessment.
Yep.
Acquisition.
Yeah, over the last 4.5 years, they've kind of slowly moved over. And for those people that were in space jobs, they were kind of told, hey, you can get a different job and stay in the Navy, or you can come to Space Force. That's kind of how that worked.
So,
Go ahead.
do you have the relationship with the Air Force like the Marine Corps has with
Yep.
the Navy?
So we're a department of the Air Force. Yep. I don't know if we're the men's department like the Marine Corps is. We haven't decided. Yes, same department of the Air Force. We have our own CSO. We manage our own budget and priorities and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the Department of the Air Force gets a say, just like the Navy does with the Marine Corps. Yes, sir. I know you raised your hand a couple times. So.
Expand on his question.
Sure.
You don't procure the hardware, the satellite.
We do.
Okay.
We do.
So you do that. that you just manage the spectrum?
We do all of it. So a lot of stuff's already in space, right? So that's just care and feeding. But for new systems that are coming on board, like some of the resilient GPS and some other kind of any new space program, the services will get together through the joint requirements process, and they will say, we have a requirement for this, whatever. And it's not this kind of satellite to do this thing. It's we have a requirement to be able to execute these kind of missions and have this kind of capability. Those requirements will funnel to Space Systems Command, and then typically there's a program executive office where that would fall under. So if it was military satellite communication and GPS, it would go to my PEO's portfolio, and they would say, hey, comms, for instance, we have a new narrowband comm requirement. The US can't do it. We need to figure out how we're going to do it. Build a new satellite, build a new payload, build a new constellation, whatever. Go figure it out. And then we contract with industry to say what's in the realm of the possible. We come up with some ideas. We send out a request for proposal, and then we go build the well, we don't build them. Industry builds them. We contract the building of the satellites. We contract the launch. And then once it's on orbit, it gets handed over to space operations in Colorado Springs. They do the flying, and then we would do the care and feeding of the satellites and also the ground system. You know, the ground isn't sexy, but that's where most of this stuff happens, right? Even with these, you know, big complex satellites, a lot of the payload processing and like getting that information to a user, all of that happens in the ground system. The ability to correct for Doppler as the satellite's flying around, all of those kind of things are typically within the ground system if that's happening. So yeah, we do tip to tail from initial inception through to disposal, Space Force.
But how do you basically take responsibility? There go the new CubeSats
Yep.
orbit coming along.
Yeah, so it depends. Well, so if it's a commercial CubeSat that has nothing to do with government, we don't have anything to do with it. Like we just we'll make sure they're following the rules kind of a deal.
But they're coming your way.
Yep, but for ours, for the ones that we kind of develop and launch, typically, it depends on how the vendor, because normally we'll have the vendor sort of work part of the launch piece, if that's part of the contract, or we'll have the vendor, hey, make sure you deliver this in this readiness state to Vandenberg on whatever date, so we can prep it for launch. We own it all the way up to initial launch. There's some initial testing, and then it goes over to Ops Command. We own it the whole time.
Do our allies have similar programs?
So in some countries, yes. So China has a service dedicated to space. UK is kind of starting to look at whether they want to chop one off like that. And I think India has an organization dedicated to space. I don't know if they've set up like a military service component yet.
That kind of keys in with what you were just talking about, but do you guys ever talk with the foreign space agencies like Russia or China?
At our level, not Russia and China, just because of where the diplomatic relations are with those countries.
Yeah.
But in general, yes. So there's an annual foreign area working group for space stuff. Each kind of niche area of space. So there's a communications one.
Yeah.
So we go to that. All of our allied nations typically will show up to that, along with some that are maybe non-standard coalition forces that we know we want to work with in the future. So we talk with them regularly. I talk with foreign partners from 4 or 5 different countries almost weekly. Yes, sir.
So how does the Starlink, the commercial system, fit into the overall potential military management control?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I don't know that everybody's really figured that out yet. So it's kind of, you know, the FAA controls a lot of launch stuff. FCC, Federal Communications Commission, controls a lot of the, like, how are you operating across that spectrum. So for most of narrowband, ultra-high frequency, it's 99% government. There's not really a commercial application for narrowband, not yet anyway, because most of it's been protected government spectrum. So typically, the commercial partners sort of have a band of spectrum that they're allowed to utilize, and they kind of beg, borrow, and steal, and they have, you know, business dealings to share spectrum and do other things. So typically what happens is if it's a commercial use case and they're launching it with their own funds and it's only for commercial application, they work out all that spectrum stuff on their own. It obviously gets certified by the FCC. At some point, there may be an inflection point where we say, hey, there's a period where if X, Y, and Z happens, you know, we have to take over part of that spectrum. But I don't know that they've at my level, we certainly don't have that ironed out. Yes, sir. And I know we're past 11. I'm happy to continue to chat for a little bit, just so anybody's paced.
How often do you get somebody who comes to recruit and says, give me a spacesuit, oh God, I want to go fight?
I imagine it probably happens a lot. That's how I was. I was like, what do you mean I can't go right to the astronaut program? I imagine that it happens routinely.